Hi, I'm James Penney. I'm the CTO of Device Authority. I'm going to be talking today about real-time authorization for IoT connected devices. To start this off, I want to take a look at some of the security challenges associated with IoT devices to really understand how this affects the underlying trust of machine identities. And firstly, as you can see here, these devices are exposed. A lot of IoT use cases call for devices to live outside of the existing enterprise security protections that we've put in place. And that enterprise network tends to be somewhat of a safe place, because within that network you have amazing firewalls, antivirus on all machines, two-factor authentication for cloud services, strict enrollment procedures for personal devices, etc. But when IoT devices are deployed outside of this traditional perimeter, for example, connected vehicles or smart agriculture, things like that, they're not necessarily protected by those existing investments. And the same can be said for physical security. There's a reason you don't put a server rack in the office kitchen or out on the sales floor. And it's not to say that salespeople can't be trusted necessarily, but there is enough of a risk of unauthorized physical access and tampering with these headless machines that you actually put them in a server facility, with a physical lock on the front door or at least behind the door. So when we deploy machine identities to remote headless like IoT devices, there is a physical risk that they get, ripped off the wall, or stolen, from the shop floor, depending on where they're mounted. So these devices are exposed. Now, that leads me to my second point. The devices are exposed and they are vulnerable. So if you take a look at the CVE database, there's over 20,000 vulnerabilities were reported in 2021. I think we're a little over 18,000 so far for 2022, and we still have like another quarter to go. So if your devices are physically exposed and susceptible to some of these new vulnerabilities, it's going to dramatically increase that attack surface. And the chances of someone being able to like abuse a 0-day vulnerability to gain access to a device or a whole network really goes up. And to my last point here, these devices can be unmonitored, and I'm not necessarily talking about like monitoring the data plane for these entities. Of course, you can, typically do that with any IoT platform. I'm really talking about the kind of taking a step back and monitoring the actual device itself after its initial enrollment, and onboarding and machine identity provisioning. The device probably looked great on day one when it was first installed. There were no attacks, no unauthorized access, all of those things. But after that machine identity is deployed and the device is like running, what does it look like? Should we still trust the device? How long before I should stop trusting this device? What deeper checks can we do to make sure that the device itself, hasn't been compromised? So I just want to take a moment to kind of level set on the differences between authentication and authorization. And as the title of this slide suggests, authentication is not equal to authorization. Authentication really is the process of validating an identity and proving who you are. And it's quite a binary question to answer, to be honest, because the answer is either yes or no. You either are that device, person, vehicle, whatever it is, or you're not, based on the identity that's being presented. And this is where an IoT device will present its machine identity, and the receiving side will be able to do, whatever checks are needed to verify it. For X509 certificates, for example, you can check the issuing authority, the expiry date, do some cryptographic mathematical equations that a really smart person has come up with. And at the end of that, you get a yes or a no answer, right? So it's quite binary in that respect. Authorization, right, is the process that comes after that. So once you've identified who you are speaking to, what do I allow you to do? Like, what are your permissions effectively? And these will be enforced by things like policies that control access to privileged resources or functions. And, I think historically these have been quite simplistic or limited in the granularity. And I know there are a few platforms and third-party providers that are kind of shifting to a more zero trust model with just-in-time access capabilities. But a lot of these are like housed within the IoT platforms themselves, and look at a sort of a limited data set, I think, and use that presented credential as the validation point, and don't take in like a wider view of some of the things that I believe should really be considered in this process. Let's talk about continuous authorization and what it means and some of the foundational elements I think that need to be considered. And then we'll look at some of the real life questions and authorization problems that I've been talking to customers about. So today, device security provisioning is considered to be really a single transaction at a given point in time that will be simply granting permissions based on some identity that's being presented to the device or by the device, sorry. So for example, if you as like an IoT device present a certificate that allows you to get a new or renew a certificate to go and connect to an IoT platform, then I will look at the identity and say, yes, for all intents and purposes, this is device 001. Here's your new certificate. But in this transaction, have we considered that the identity may have been stolen, for example, or that the device is in a critically bad state, either through, like lack of updates or because someone physically stole the device and is using it at home from a completely new location, running unauthorized software? So what is the real trust level or authorization level for that particular device? Now, there is new legislation that's appearing that are forcing some companies to adopt somewhat of a continuous authorization and validation approach, which is a really great start. Things like the software bill of materials, or SBOM, as sometimes referred, the executive order that effectively forces device manufacturers to provide a list of software components that are shipped with a device. So we can't underestimate that, absolutely, but you really have to take that information and include it in something like a continuous authorization process to help build like an overall sort of trust profile of the device, and then apply sort of some additional authorization and control sort of on top of that. So we can now talk about some of the foundational elements for a continuous sort of device authorization framework and how they tie into each other. So if we actually start at the top right here in this particular slide, we'll start with attestation. So as I mentioned before, the groundwork to applying any authorization process is the authentication and the attestation of the machine identity. But not only looking at the device identity element itself, it's also about tying that machine identity to the physical device. And this means when you do that, you can do things like prevent identity spoofing, detect device cloning, because you're actually binding the presented identity to the physical, I guess, manifestation of the device that it represents. And then next, moving down to the bottom right, we can look at the context. So context has a few different sub-elements within it that really need to be carefully considered. The request context is important because the request itself in isolation might not be a cause for concern. But again, if I look at the wider parameters of the request, what am I going to see, right? Is this the fifth time the device is trying to do this today? When usually it only does it once. All 999 versions of the same device model that I've deployed elsewhere only try to do this once a day between 10 a.m. and 11 a.m. Why is my device requesting a new certificate at 3 a.m. from GPS coordinates that look suspiciously like the location of my competitor's factory, right? All of these things to be considered in regards to the context of the device and the actual request and what's being asked for. And then, also the device state. I recognize it's actually a fairly loaded question, and I'll go into a few examples on the next slide. But what does the overall trust profile of that device look like? For example, is the software all up to date? If you take the SBOM or software bill of materials into account, it says here in your SBOM that you should be running OpenSSL 1.1 at least, or 3.0, because that's what you shipped with. But for some reason, this device has version 1.0, which is filled with a whole bunch of critical CVEs. And should you really be trusted in the context of what you're trying to do here? Then moving to the left, bottom left here. So policy controls. So let's say that I've proven the device identity and I've considered the context of the transaction and the device state. What is the resulting action that we're really going to apply here? Well, I mean, if you're trying to get a new X.509 certificate and you have OpenSSL 1.0, right, with critical vulnerabilities, maybe I'll hold off authorizing that transaction until you're into a better state. Or maybe this device is so critical that it needs to be running for whatever reason. And maybe I'll let you have the certificate, but because you're a risk, what we're actually going to do is limit the expiry to like 24 hours or a week, or something that greatly kind of reduces the potential fallout or collateral damage if that identity is compromised. And maybe I'll also ask you, like check in every 24 hours so I can validate some of your other properties or behavior in like an ongoing basis. And then lastly, kind of top left here, we should bring in communication and automation with third parties, right? In IoT, there are so many technologies and platforms that make up a real production deployment. Keeping them all in sync is a critical component of trust. If I detect, for example, that my device missed its newly mandated daily authorization check like 3 times in a row, I will reach out to the CA, revoke the credentials. I will, reach out to the IoT platform and tell it to disable the device. I will send an alert to the security, response desk to highlight the fact that there's a problem with that particular device. So it all comes together to create what is essentially the continuous assurance, really to reduce the risk of compromised machine identities. And the policies and automation are all there to help you deal with it at sort of IoT scale. So now we can kind of take a look at some of the, examples or validation points, sort of leveraging in their use cases. Firstly, I've spoken about it already, but SBOM is a popular topic. Is my device still running the same version that it shipped with? Even if it is, are there any critical CVEs that we need to consider? Let's say a component of my software one day has a new perfect CVE score, like a 10 or whatever, just like Log4j that ruined every engineering team's Christmas last year. In that situation, I want to revoke the credentials and probably cut the device off. It poses too much of a risk. Malware is another angle. Headless devices are a great target for anyone wanting to run malicious software, such as like participating in like DDoS attacks, distributed denial of service attacks, or cryptocurrency miners, because there's no human attached to necessarily report how slow the device is running now. So potentially, I want to perform a daily, continuous authorization check on my devices to ensure it's only running known good software and not making me potentially liable in some kind of civil suit because my devices, participated in knocking out internet for most of the Eastern Seaboard. Hardware validation. That's as another consideration. Depending, it may seem silly in this day and age, don't use USB sticks, but depending on the environment, hardware hacking or even simply inserting an unauthorized USB stick or cable into a device could be grounds to revoke the credentials. If you remember, like jackpotting attacks against ATMs a number of years ago, which got very popular, where you could actually just physically alter, I think they drilled a hole or whatever, plugged a cable in and managed to get the ATM to release all the cash. So it's still a very serious consideration because they're not within your physical control. And lastly, behavior analysis, and it's always an interesting one. Security is always a layered approach, but in an age where zero-day threats are more prevalent, it can really help to look for the indicators of compromise rather than spend every cycle trying to pinpoint exactly how someone gets in. For example, if the CPU is running 100% utilization, 24 hours a day, then maybe there's something running on that device that there shouldn't be. Or maybe I can work in, let's say, conjunction with an enterprise firewall, and then I can understand how often that device is connecting in. With that right data, I can leverage a machine learning process to really help understand deviations from like baseline behavior and find those indicators of compromise. So, in summary, and to really wrap up here, IoT really needs to move from a more, the traditional sort of authorization model to a where we're taking that identity at face value to a sort of a new continuous validation and authorization model that will really allow organizations to, I guess, more proactively monitor their devices and get a better understanding of the device trust assurance levels, really to drive smarter decisions and more real time authorization decisions about machine identities that are effectively sitting out in the wild outside of that traditional perimeter.